it literally drove him into a direction that may have seemed different from the core Springfield sound, but for him as an artist, it was so indicative, again, of how he didn't feel the need to be constricted in any way by the personnel in the band. Even at that early stage, he was willing to step outside the lines, as it were, and take chances that had never been taken before.
Probably Expecting to Fly is, if you had to pick one song from the Springfield canon, for Stills it would be For What It's Worth, for Neil Young it would be Expecting to Fly, simply because it's unique.
There you stood on the edge of your feather, expecting to fly.
There's a lot going on in that song in terms of music that was certainly different from Mr. Soul, and different from Nowadays Clancy Can't Even Sing as well. So he was really trying to stretch the boundaries. But frustration at having no money eventually led him to come back to the Buffalo Springfield, which in fact he brought that track with him and completed with the band. And when you listen to Buffalo Springfield again, it's such a pastiche of different styles. But when Expecting to Fly comes along, it's just so out of left field. It's like nothing you've ever heard before or since.
I mean, it is a career highlight, but what makes it interesting is that it was a diversion that he never really, after the first solo album, followed through. He turned his back on that whole style of record making, and yet it clearly fascinated him for a brief moment in time. And on Expecting to Fly, with the help of Jack Nietzsche, he absolutely mastered it.
Buffalo Springfield again would be the career high point for the band. In 1968, Bruce Palmer was arrested and deported to Canada, and despite a prominent tour with the Beach Boys, Buffalo Springfield announced their demise amidst drugs busts and infighting. A posthumous album, Last Time Around, was released, but it was largely viewed as a postscript in a failed attempt at the big time.
Last Time Around, the third and final Buffalo Springfield album, is barely worth talking about, quite honestly. It's just a mishmash put together after the band had effectively broken up. Neil had announced in advance his intention to leave the group. At that point, he took a lot of his best songs with him because he was already planning his first solo album. He had virtually withdrawn from the whole setup at that point and taken his bat and ball away to play elsewhere. He hated the record, didn't really want anything to do with it, and you know, coming after such a great album as Buffalo Springfield again, it's a major disappointment, and perhaps they'd have been better not putting it out at all.
Stills, Young, and Foray never wrote together. They wrote on their own. And then they started producing their own tracks and bringing in their own musicians to record their own tracks. So you had the band falling apart. Even as they were still recording and being together, the band was becoming three individuals with a drummer and a bass player in tow. So it never really had that unity to it. And strong-willed individuals, each seeking their own level of success. Less so Richie, but certainly Stephen and Neil. Two really strong-willed, determined, large egos wanting to steer the ship their own way and being unable to. How do you contain that within a band? How do you keep that together within a band? You can't. I mean, it was just destined to implode, and it did. All, you know, again, far too soon.
It was not too soon for Young, who had his sights set on the creative freedom of a solo career. He signed up with manager Elliot Roberts, who had previously been interested in taking charge of Buffalo Springfield. And before long, a deal was secured with Warner subsidiary Reprise. Moving to Topanga Canyon, he met young producer David Briggs and began to work on his first solo album. Released in December 1968, his self-titled debut also featured further work with Jack Nietzsche.
I think Neil Young, the first album, the eponymous album, is unique in Neil Young's canon. I think it's one of his best albums. I always did. It was, for many people, it was their introduction to Neil Young, I suppose. Not for many, actually. Looking back on it, it would probably be after the Gold Rush. But that record was released very belatedly in the UK and wasn't successful in the US at all. It was the only Neil Young album, I think, that didn't make the Billboard Top 100 throughout his entire career. It has lots of different elements to it, I think, that make it strong. But most of all, I think it's the songs that make it. I think there are some excellent songs.
I love that album. And I'm probably one of the few that actually loves that album. What the first solo album represents is really a step back to Neil in '67 and the Jack Nietzsche sound. The very dense sound, the overdubbed guitars, and a lot of keyboard. It has a thickness to it. It's a heavy album, not certainly from crunching guitars and Marshall amps. It's heavy because it's got a dense sound to it, which again was the hallmark of Jack Nietzsche. To me, I like that. I like that sound from Neil. And it did seem to me to be a logical extension of what he was doing in the Buffalo Springfield to carry it on further. It didn't, that album doesn't seem out of step.
He's a perfect stranger, like a cross of himself in a fault.
The Loner, in many ways, both lyrically and musically, gives a beautiful insight into where Neil Young was at that time in his life. He was alone but together musically. He was dealing with a lot of fractions and upsets in his life, but pouring it into his music. He had a musical ally in Jack Nietzsche, but also David Briggs, who would become even more important to him on later albums. And that first record gave so many interesting glimpses into the breadth of his musical ability, with a song like The Loner, which had a very electric edge to it, but not as edgy as he would become later on. He was still willing to overdub at that point.
The Loner is, to me, a sort of bridge between the Springfield Neil Young and Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. It's neither one nor the other. Jackson Browne said that the first albums by Neil Young and Joni Mitchell were the beginning of the singer-songwriter movement. And although it wasn't a particularly successful record, that first album, and it's a kind of lost album in some ways, it's a very important kind of artifact, really, because it really is, it's a guy leaving a band, not a huge band, but a kind of a band that had quite a lot of hype around it, and saying, I'm basically, what I'm really going to do is carve out my own little world, I'm going to move to Topanga Canyon, and I'm going to plough my own furrow, really.
On its release, the album was all but ignored by audiences. Yet a track relegated to the B-side of the single The Loner would become one of Young's most enduring compositions, Sugar Mountain.
Sugar Mountain is what would always be known as a concert favourite. It was probably Neil Young's most famous B-side. It was all more B-sides than I'd care to shake a stick out looking back.
In some ways, the song has kind of the spirit of the blues, in that there's this great sense of loss, and it's not it's not rebellion, it's wistful, and he's contemplating what it means to continue to be in the world without that innocence, and that's grown-up stuff. That's the stuff of the blues, of soul music, of country music.
I think part of its mythology came from the fact that Joni Mitchell then wrote a direct reply to the song, which was the circle game, and the seasons go round and round, and the painted ponies go up and down. We're all captive on a carousel of time, and this was terribly attractive, this idea of these two great Canadian songwriters replying to each other, having this dialogue, this conversation in song. And I think it's as much to do with that as anything else that Sugar Mountain became this sort of key song in Young's early repertoire.
Since his days in Buffalo Springfield, Young had been jamming intermittently with a band called the Rockets. During the latter part of 1968, he had resumed these sessions, and in the January of the following year booked studio time in LA. 3 of the Rockets members joined him for the new album: Danny Whitten, Billy Talbot and Ralph Molina. This impromptu band was renamed Crazy Horse, and the fruit of this labour, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, was released in May. It proved to be a far more successful album for Young.
Jesus Is Nowhere is a classic album. I think it was the first album that brought Neil to some kind of critical attention in America, although you have to stress yet again that it wasn't actually released in Britain until around the time of After the Gold Rush. It was a famous import album, but it announced to the world, or the hip world I suppose, that Neil Young had arrived.
That whole grunge and punk thing, certainly the roots of it are in that Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere album. It's four guys in a studio, and it's not overdubs, and it's not getting the right take, and it's not making sure the pitch is just right. It's turn the amps on, run the tape, and let's just get this down. And that became certainly Neil's recording style and his aesthetic from that point on. It's not about the perfection, it's about the moment.
The driving force of a song like Cinnamon Girl, without question, is Crazy Horse. And the fact that Neil Young had aligned himself with Ralph Molina, Billy Talbot, and Danny Whitten, I think pushed him in a harder-edged direction than some of his previous associates had.
And they epitomise this raw, earthy sound he was looking for, and the chemistry that he discovered with the Rockets, who became Crazy Horse. And all three of those songs, interestingly, were, it is said, written on the same day. He was in bed with a fever of 103, 104, and had pieces of paper strewn all over the counterpane, writing these songs. And the lyrics have all got this slightly feverish quality. He's compos mentis, but his mind is just slightly moved somewhere to the left. And I think those three songs, and he has continued to perform them live for more than 30 years, which speaks for itself. They're the core of the record and the core of the sound that he was looking for with Crazy Horse, and really became the template for that sound, which he returned to regularly over his entire career.
Be on my side, I'll be on your side. There is no reason for you to hide.
Down by the River really takes you on a musical trip. I mean, it's got the deep sort of obtuse lyrics that you can't quite figure out what they're about. And then it's got the long guitar solo that just keeps going and going and going and going and going. And it starts with this kind of a one-note thing that he plays over and over. At that point, if you look at his recording on that first solo album, even before that in Buffalo Springfield, there weren't any long guitar solos at all. They were short, they were measured, and they were often worked out in advance. But now he's just letting it flow and letting the tape run and catching all of it. And the song is really a trip.
Despite being lauded as one of a new breed of singer-songwriters, the album would see Neil departing from his folk and from his Springfield past, and confounding expectations for his solo career by escaping from the shadow of his great influence, Bob Dylan.
When Neil first came to Los Angeles, I don't think it's necessarily clear that he's thinking of himself as a singer-songwriter, by which I mean in the hyphenated sense that we mean. Obviously, he saw himself as a songwriter on some level. He's always been self-conscious about his singing, for very good reasons. And so at the time, and there really wasn't such a thing. You know, in 1965, he's not coming into that milieu. Dylan's contemporaries as a singer-songwriter in New York hadn't had a great commercial impact at that point. You know, the Eric Andersons, the Phil Oakes, the Tom Paxtons, you know, the Eric von Schmidts, they're known to a niche market. They're not huge popular figures like Dylan was. So when you start to get the second wave of American singer-songwriters, the ones that are very clearly Dylan's children, the Tim Buckleys and the Tim Hardins of this world,